We have a couple of more things that we are going to talk about today. One having to do with treatment evaluation, intervention evaluation, kind of following up on the plans that you all came up with for the case examples. And then just talk about building interventions in the context of a database decision-making model. And then we'll sum up, some of the most salient points that I've been trying to emphasize today, and then open it up for additional questions or broader discussion that you may have at this point. Where we can start is to think about intervention evaluation and the importance of intervention evaluation in terms of the overall plan. As I mentioned to you earlier this morning, I don't remember a circumstance where I've ever worked with a school situation or a family situation where myself or the other team members came up with the perfect plan right out of the box. Maybe you guys are able to do that, and more power to you if you are, but typically intervention plans have some bumps. They have some challenges. That's inevitable. The other thing is that for many of the plans that we've been talking about today, you're setting initial goals and setting initial procedures at a certain level to build success. And then as success is attained, you're modifying those. You're modifying those procedures, you're modifying those goals. And it's important that those decisions about modification are based on data. That it's not just a gut feeling. It's not just how you've done it in the past. But it's actually based on some information and some data that leads you to believe that these changes are necessary or will be successful. So what kind of intervention evaluation data do we think about? And many of these things you all mentioned as we went through the case examples. So one thing to think about is what was the original set of assessment data that we collected on an individual student, and taking either all of that or more likely some portion of that and strategically repeating that assessment periodically as you intervene. So you have a baseline with which to work with, so you have a metric in terms of where the student is at initially, and you're getting periodic reads on any changes that may have occurred, hopefully in the positive direction, using the same assessment techniques that you used prior to intervention. More likely, you're going to want to selectively choose those assessment instruments. You're not going to do your entire evaluation battery. You're going to choose some that are specifically tied to the goals that you've set for the student and tied to the intervention. So that's certainly one way to go. So that would include teacher ratings, perhaps observations, perhaps, as some of you mentioned, you'd be actually using academic products that the kids produced, their seat work and their other, their test scores and so forth. You have those already available to you both before and after the intervention. Another thing to think about that we don't often do, at least in practice, we see this in research but not so much in practice, is to get consumer satisfaction ratings from teachers, from students, potentially even from parents. How well do they think things are working? How satisfied are they in the intervention? I believe one of the groups, it might have been talking about Heather, the 13-year-old, where one of the ideas for the intervention evaluation plan was to briefly interview the teacher and the student and the parents as to their impressions of whether things worked or not. That's along the lines of what I'm thinking about, is some kind of brief measure of whether the consumers themselves are satisfied with it. There's actually some scales that have been developed for this purpose, some structured scales. One called the Intervention Rating Profile, for example, has 15 items. I don't know that you need to do that in practice. It's probably overkill. It's just more of actually getting information from teachers and students as to whether they feel that things are working and that the intervention is feasible and effective. Another metric that we can use to see if our intervention's working is compare outcomes with non-ADHD peers. To what extent are the interventions that we've been implementing bringing the students with ADHD within the range of what's expected and what's seen by other classmates who don't have ADHD? In some ways, we're talking about normalization of performance. To what degree are interventions normalizing academic functioning, normalizing social functioning, normalizing behavioral functioning? Now, I have to tell you that that's a steep goal to set for an intervention, normalization. And in fact, most studies of medication treatment for ADHD have not shown normalization of functioning. It is a lofty goal, but one that you do want to check out. You want to see to what degree have your interventions not only made an impact for that student in terms of change, but to what degree have we brought that student more within the range of what's expected and what's seen in the normative peer group. And so how do we do that? Well, if we have work completion information, for example, for all students, we can compare the relative degree of work completion for our student to their peers. Many of the rating scales that we have available, the behavior rating scales we have available, have normative data. And you can look at scores for a given student relative to their peers of the same age and the same gender. And you get an idea of how much normalization has taken place using those kind of measures. The other thing to think about is, as I mentioned to you before, is to revise the treatment plan based on those data. We're making database decisions. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. Are there any side effects to our intervention? Unintended negative or aversive effects of our intervention. And that may seem like a strange thing to mention here because we're not talking about medication, but there's no reason why some of the interventions that we apply couldn't potentially have negative side effects similar, not the same as medication, but we always think about side effects in the context of medication. We don't think about it in terms of the things we do. So for example, what are the side effects of a behavioral point system in a regular classroom for one student? Are there potential side effects to that? So maybe some isolation, some setting apart the student as different, maybe some eliciting some jealousy on the part of classmates, and you already have students presumably that may already have some social relationship difficulties. Maybe that's going to exacerbate those.
The teacher might feel resentful too of having to do that for one child.
Teacher might be resentful, and perhaps that might affect their interactions with that child or that child's parents. So the point is that our interventions are not pristine. They're happening within an environmental context, and there is the potential that you could have some aversive side effects. Does that mean you don't use the intervention? No. I mean, think about the analogy with medication. There are plenty of children who are medicated who are experiencing some side effects, and those side effects are addressed in a variety of ways: lowering the dosage, changing the medication, adding another medication to the regimen. There's a lot of different ways that side effects are handled with medication. Same thing here. If we see side effects, for example, to our behavioral point system, then we need to think about, are there changes we can make to it to make it more surreptitious or unobtrusive? Are there other ways that we can include other students, let's say in a class-wide system where the jealousy issue doesn't become that big a deal? So the idea, though, is that we're at least looking for the potential side effects of our interventions and having that have some impact on any modifications we make to the treatment plan. So in a larger level, when we think about intervention evaluation, we're really looking at a database decision-making model. The idea here is that we're engaging in a problem-solving process. Whenever we're addressing the needs of a student with ADHD or similar disorders, we're doing that in the context of a problem-solving model using data. that's going to be the most productive way to go about this. So what does that mean? Well, it means that first we have to decide what the problem is or what the problems are. There are multiple problems. So we're working with teachers and the school team to go through these steps of identifying, maybe providing some additional information about ADHD, but more importantly, to walk through these steps of looking at what are the triggers and what are the consequences of a, well, first of all, I shouldn't say that quickly. First thing is we identify what's the area of concern. Now I have academic up here, but you could substitute in there social area of concern or behavioral area of concern. In other words, identifying the specific problem or problems in each area of functioning at a very specific level. Then once you do that, you're looking at what are the environmental context to those problem areas. What's the triggering them, so the antecedent events, and what's following them, what are the consequences of these problems, whether they be academic, social, or behavioral. And then we're looking for a pattern to these. This is very similar to the functional behavioral assessment approach, right? You may recognize that. So you're identifying the problem, you're looking at the environmental context of that problem. Next, you're setting some goals, prioritizing those goals, and agreeing on some additional data collection that may be gathered here. Again, this is an academic situation example, so there's an academic assessment, and presumably the consultant, whoever that might be, would be collecting some additional academic assessment data, but you could apply this to social functioning and behavioral functioning just as readily. So the stage here of database decision making is to identify the problem, identify the environmental context for the problem, what are the goals that we want to set initially, and what assessment data can we gather in baseline before we intervene. So agreeing with the teacher in this case, or the parent, depending on who you're working with, what kind of data are going to be collected as a baseline. Okay, so that's the first step. The next step is to actually do the assessment. And again, I'm using an academic example here where an observation is being made during the classroom situation where the problem is occurring, and information is gathered about the target student's behavior, the teacher's behavior, and the peers' behaviors, looking again at triggers and consequences, again, part of a descriptive functional behavioral assessment. In the case of academic functioning, maybe comparing the students' work products to their peers. So again, getting an idea of what is it actually that they're producing now, how deviant or different is that from what's being gathered from their peers. And then again, in the case of academic functioning, doing a basic skills assessment using curriculum-based assessment. If you're familiar with that. In the case of social skills, you're doing some kind of survey of social skills that are in the repertoire of the student. What's the purpose of this? The purpose of this is to decide how much of the problem is a skills deficit, that is a lack of skill academically, a lack of skill socially, versus a performance deficit, meaning the child has the skills in their repertoire, but they don't perform they don't perform them consistently. Okay, so the data help us to determine how much of this is attributable to a skills deficit versus a performance deficit. The data also help us to determine, is the teacher's perception of what's going on now, I hate to use the word accurate because, you know, observation may not be accurate either, but to what degree is there a match between how the teacher sees the situation and how an independent observer sees the situation? Because there could be some discrepancies there as well. And then the third thing that this gives us is baseline data. Tells us where the kid is at now in a particular functioning area, gives us an idea of whether our goals are realistic, and serves as baseline to evaluate our treatment against. Now, my guess is you probably do some of this already in the teams that you work with, some similar kinds of processes. So maybe I'm just kind of emphasizing what's already done. But the idea here is that before you actually intervene, there's multiple things that have to happen in order to set up that intervention. The next stage is problem analysis. And this is where we determine the specifics of an intervention plan based on the data we've gathered and the hypotheses we've generated from those data. So, for example, at a basic level, we want to know, are we dealing with a skills deficit or a performance deficit? Because if we're dealing with a skills deficit, what kind of intervention component do we want to make sure is part of the plan? Instructional component. That a motivational component alone is not going to be sufficient if we are dealing with a skills deficit. If we are not dealing with a skills deficit that is primarily a performance deficit, then you know that an instructional component is probably going to have limited utility and that you're going to be primarily looking at preventive and motivational strategies. Everybody's with me on that, right? Okay. So the next step then is to work collaboratively as a team, whether that's a pair, the consultant and the teacher, whether it's a larger team. I'm not sure exactly how your process runs, but whatever, there's a collaborative discussion of what interventions make sense based on the presumed function of behavior, if we're dealing with a behavioral functioning area. So what's the function of the behavior based on our descriptive assessment? What's the intervention plan that's viable in terms of any skill deficits that might be present? And what are the goals that we're going to set based on the data, the initial data that we have? How realistic are those goals, and how much are they in terms of tied to the baseline data? So we want to make sure that we're using those baseline data to set those goals. Our role as consultants, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, is to make sure that whatever plans are being considered are evidence-based. That they don't just feel good or look good, but that there's some evidence behind them. And the evidence in terms of tying to a particular student's needs. And usually there's a brainstorming process that's engaged in either as a team or with one-on-one with a teacher in terms of what strategies might make sense given the presumed function of the behavior, the presence or absence of skill deficits, and the level of baseline data. And then the teacher selects from that menu of interventions, and we work to decide how those are going to get implemented. So there's a collaborative model here where ultimately the teacher needs to agree that the intervention is going to be implemented. Now, as you all know, some teachers are more open to different strategies than others. And sometimes we have to play a persuasive role to make sure that the most effective interventions are put in place. But the bottom line is that teachers have to be on board with this. And the most effective way for them to be on board is to feel like they're a stakeholder, that they have some say in what they're doing, and that there's collaborative opportunities here. Some interventions are going to need some support. That some teachers may not be familiar with certain strategies, and they may require some education about those strategies, some modeling and role playing and feedback in terms of those interventions. We need to do that obviously before we implement the strategies. Then also at this stage, we're talking about monitoring progress. How frequently are we going to collect progress monitoring data? And who's going to collect the data? Now, presumably, it's going to be a continuation of the data collection that was agreed upon in baseline. As we talked about earlier, it's very important that the metric that we're looking at is the same in baseline and in intervention. Otherwise, we're comparing apples and oranges. So presumably that continuing data collection of what was started in baseline will continue, but you still need to decide how often, who's going to do it, are we going to add additional data collection to that. The other thing that ideally we would look at, and I don't know how much this is built into the systems that you guys use, but we want to see how well do people who are implementing the intervention adhere to the intervention. Treatment adherence, treatment integrity. And that's treatment fidelity. That's another synonym for this. And here's the sobering fact that I'm sure you're dealing with as well as everybody else, is that treatment integrity, treatment fidelity for most interventions is not all that high. And it shouldn't be too surprising because even for medication treatment, giving a pill to a student at a prescribed period of time. So taking the pill, opening the pill box, taking the correct pill out, giving them, making sure that it's swallowed. Pretty straightforward set of steps. Now, in the adherence for psychopharmacology in general is maybe around 50 to 60%. Okay, certainly not 100%. So should it be any surprise to us that a fairly complex set of steps that might be involved in a point system, for example, implemented in a classroom where there's 20 kids, that sometimes adherence may be less than 100%. Shouldn't be a big surprise that that's going to be the case. So all the more reason why we need to monitor that and provide feedback to teachers in terms of are there consistent steps that are being skipped over, or are there steps that are being implemented incorrectly? So we need to monitor that and provide feedback. That obviously takes time and resources that aren't always available. There are some other ways to monitor intervention adherence. For example, if we're doing a daily report card system, the daily report cards themselves are a measure of adherence. At least the portion of the program that involves collection of ratings and teachers' initials and that kind of stuff. You've got permanent products of that piece of the intervention that you can call upon. Now, that doesn't tell you whether the reinforcers at home were applied appropriately or all that, but at least gives you an idea of whether the school-based part of it is being implemented appropriately. So depending on the intervention, you want to look for, are there permanent products that are generated by the intervention that can give you a clue as to whether adherence is present or not. And you know, at a basic level, you could ask teachers or other people who are implementing to check off the steps as they do them. And of course, people can go and do that on their own without doing the steps. We know that. But the fact that you have a checklist, they know they're being monitored, increases the odds that people will do at least some of those steps. So whatever you can do to enhance and monitor treatment integrity, you want to at least try to do. Okay, so this is the problem analysis piece. Let me stop here for a second and questions, comments on anything we talked about so far in terms of this database decision-making process. Yeah.
The issue that I think a lot of us working in the school system here have is that we're working with EBD students, and our requirements are every EBD student has to have an EBIT. So I might be working with 50 kids who have FABs and BITs. The teacher might have 20 students in their class. It just becomes unwieldy.
Right.
It just becomes very difficult to do.
It's resource intensive, the number of functional assessments that you have to monitor and number of behavior intervention plans you have to monitor.
And also now, other ESC students who have more than 6 days of suspension have to have them. So I work in high school right now that the PMT and I are trying to monitor about 150 FABs and BITs, and it's like, it's impossible to do.
Right. Right, and I guess when you're in that situation where you have limited resources, limited time, you have to get into triaging and prioritizing, and that obviously has limitations for those kids that aren't prioritized.
I mean, it sounds great if you had if I was working on 5 at a time.
Sure.
Maybe really good, but otherwise it just becomes very, very difficult.
Yeah, so and I think that's where you think about your caseload in terms of some will, a few, precious few that you can maybe do the ideal with. And then there's a whole bunch where you're much looser, okay, but you're still getting, like, let's say the teacher's checking off the steps, they're doing whatever. And then there's some that almost run themselves, maybe. Not a lot, but there's some that you're not attending to as much. So, you know, maybe you've got to look at it, or you probably already do this, but you're looking at that caseload strategically, but always keeping in mind that the ideal is out there, okay, and that for particularly tough cases and severe cases, somehow some of those things have to be put in place. Otherwise, you're not going to get much in the way of outcome. Yes?
I think we could help, because in my case, I don't even have the ABD counselor in my school. There's 3 of us, 2 guidances, myself as trust, and 1,500 students. I would like to see more teachers sitting in those types of training, because we kind of know a lot of the stuff already. We know it works, but we have to sell our fish. And teachers and parents think they can just send the problem kids to us, and then we're going to wave a little magic wand and say a spell or something, and the kid's going to go back perfect.
Right.
So I think if we educate teachers and parents, this could work a little better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it this way, that for ADHD, the therapists for kids with ADHD are parents and teachers. They're the therapists. And so our job, if we're not parents and teachers of these kids, our job is to try to provide that education and support if we can, so that those therapists, the parents and teachers, can be effective in what they're doing, effective intervention agents. And again, I realize limited resources in terms of doing all that, but that's where we need to go. I mean, I'm thinking even more basic level. I work in a college of education. I'm on a faculty of a college of education. What I need to do more of, that I don't do enough of, is right now I train school psychologists and special educators. I don't have much contact with general educators in training. You know, and I think it's important for myself as a faculty member in a college of education to be looking at the next generation of general education teachers in terms of learning some of these kinds of things, particularly as we move more and more towards inclusion. So anyway, I realize that this is very much ideal, but the idea is at least to know that's out there, and maybe, in some cases, be able to apply some of this. Treatment evaluation, we've already talked about. This part of the database decision-making process, but at a very basic level, we're looking visually in terms of our data to decide where we are at, what our status is. So one example may be mastery. You know, the intervention worked, and we're cool, and we move on. We move on to another goal, we move on to another problem. Another possibility is no progress has been made. If that's the case, then we may need to go back to the beginning of the process. Maybe we were off base in terms of setting the goal. Maybe we were off base in terms of the presumed function of the behavior. Maybe we were off base in terms of the intervention plan that we came up with based on our data. So something's wrong. Or maybe it hasn't been implemented at all. There's no adherence. And that's a possibility too. So we need to look at why has no progress been made, and that can tell us what stage we need to go back to. If there's adequate progress being made, but we haven't reached mastery, then we continue the intervention. We probably make some minor tweaks to it, but we just continue the plan as is. And then, of course, we could have a partial progress, or excuse me, inadequate progress. So we have some partial progress, but it's not at a level or a trend or slope that we want to see, in which case we know that we keep some components of the intervention, but there are other parts of it we need to change. So we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in this case, but we think about, okay, what are the components we want to retain, and then what do we build on to deal with that so we get more adequate progress. And then the other possibility is that we could have a motivation problem on the part of the student, a motivation problem on the part of the teacher or the parent, and we need to be thinking about how do we build better motivation in, if we can. And then we're determining the next steps. I already mentioned this, leaving the plan in place, simplifying the plan, redefining the goals, improving the focus on triggers, or some retraining. It may be that the teacher's making a good effort with the plan, but some steps he or she is having some challenges with, so we need to provide some additional education on that so that it's implemented correctly. But we're tying, again, the whole point is we're making decisions about our intervention based on data. Data-based decision-making, for those of you who are returning tomorrow, we're going to talk about that in more detail in the context of consultation. But any further questions or comments on that topic? Yes?
I like what you're saying about, that the student knows the skills and it's expected that it isn't transferring, that it's a motivation problem. Because, I'll work with a kid for 5 years and, I'll think he'll have it down, have a great session, and he'll go out there in PE and have a fight, and the teacher starts getting upset with him and me, and it's like, so I bring the student in, I go, what should you, well, they know exactly what they should have done.
Yeah.
So then it is motivational, so then what?
Yeah, so then what we do is we think about, okay, what can happen in the point of performance? How can we structure that situation at the point of performance to prompt and reinforce the skills that are now in the kid's data repertoire, skill set? So we'll go back to the PE teacher and we say, okay, these are the things we've been working on. And these are consistent with what you want. I realize we're dealing with it may be a difficult situation, but the idea is that if that PE teacher wants to see the product of that intervention, then he or she is going to have to get on board with prompting and reinforcing what's happening. So they're going to have to, you have to give them some idea, okay, here are the skills we're working on. Prime the student for this prior to PE class, and then as they happen, reinforce them. Now, again, are all PE teachers going to be on board with that? Probably not. But if they're expecting an outcome, then at that point of performance, then the only thing that's going to make that generalization occur is that somehow in that environment, the child has to be prompted to remember, oh yeah, these are the things I've been working on, and then getting some kind of feedback that they're doing the right thing. And short of that,
the
you're not
teacher
going
has
to
to buy into it at that point.
Exactly.
Really, I've done all I could do with the kid at that moment.
Right, because you think about it this way, and you think about it in a PE context, okay? You can train a kid in practice for an athletic skill, dribbling a basketball, and shooting it. And they're just, one-on-one with a coach working on those skills. And they got it down. But you throw them out there in the middle of a game without, prompting and giving them any feedback, and what's going to happen? 9 times out of 10, they're not going to apply those skills then. There's too many distracting stimuli, it's different. They get excited, they're emotional, whatever. They're not going to dribble the ball the same way. They're not going to shoot the ball the same way. So it's the same kind of thing here. You're working on social skills. You've got it up to a certain speed in a one-on-one coaching environment. And now you're trying to apply it to the game, which is, in this case, the PE class. So how can that happen? And it's only going to happen if the person in the PE class is prompting and reinforcing and giving feedback. The last thing that we're going to talk about is school-based services for students with ADHD. This is kind of the broader legal framework, if you will, for providing services to students with ADHD in the schools. It's not specific interventions per se, but it's more of the identification of students with ADHD for either special education services or educational accommodations or both. So right now, there's several different possibilities. One is that a student with ADHD could qualify for access to special education on the basis of having an educational disability. So for example, if they're identified with a learning disability, or if they're identified with EBD or SED, I don't know what your terminology here is in Florida, but with emotional behavioral disturbance, EBD. Okay, so if they have an existing educational classification, then obviously they can gain access, if it's appropriate and necessary, to special education. Another possibility is they can qualify for education, for special education services on the basis of something called other health impairment, or OHI. Now, OHI has kind of an interesting history in education, special education law and regulations. It first appeared when IDEA was first put together as a category to address the educational needs of kids with chronic illnesses. Asthma, diabetes, cancer, other things along those lines, or physical disabilities of some sort. So they have access to a wheelchair, they have access to medication, they can leave the class to go use their inhaler, all of those kinds of things come under OHI. And to the extent that their health impairment impacted their educational functioning, they could get special education. So for example, kid with cancer misses a lot of school, maybe misses out on a lot of academic opportunities, and perhaps as a function of the treatment of that cancer, has some brain functioning changes, because chemotherapy can impact cognitive functioning. And so as a function of that, they need some special education. Okay, so that's where OHI started. In the early 1990s, the CHAD organization, which I presume you're familiar with, that's the international parent support organization for children and adults with ADHD. That's what CHAD stands for. Actually started in Plantation, Florida, which is right near here, right? Okay, that's where it started. The first CHAD group was in Plantation, Florida. Anyway, this group grew, okay, and grew in power and grew in advocacy. And in the early 90s, they were partnering with some other advocacy groups to impact Congress to include ADHD as a separate educational disability that would qualify for special education. Separate from LD, separate from EBD, separate from cognitive impairments, et cetera. The compromise that was reached at that time, in 1991, by the Office of Special Education Programs, the U.S. Department of Education office, was that from now on, from 1991 on, kids with ADHD could be considered OHI, could be considered for special education on the basis of ADHD alone, but through the existing mechanism of OHI. So they didn't create a new category for kids with ADHD, but they said, okay, under certain conditions, they could qualify just by having ADHD through the OHI category. That started in 1991. Since 1991, do you want to take a guess what the fastest growing educational disability group in the country is? OHI. What's that? Yeah, so, and in large part, obviously, due to this change in interpretation. So we're going to talk about the qualifications for OHI here in a second. The other possibility, and it's separate from special education now, is that students with ADHD could qualify for accommodations in the general ed classroom, in particular, under Section 504. Section 504, as you're probably aware, is a civil rights code. It is separate from IDEA. It is not special education. It is a civil rights code. It carries no money with it. Some might argue that the special education law doesn't carry any money with it either, but on paper, special education is supposed to carry money with it, from the federal office to the state to the local level. Section 504 has no money associated with it unless you're caught violating it. If you violate Section 504 and you're found to violate the civil rights of somebody with a disability, you can be fined. And you can lose federal funding. Most common examples of this are, and this is not recently, but in the past, is buildings that were not accessible to those with disabilities, that kind of thing. If you didn't have wheelchair ramps or other things along those lines, you could get fined. Let's talk about, you already know the criteria, you probably know all criteria for all three of these, but what we're going to review more specifically is items 2 and 3, qualifying for special education under OHI, and then qualifying for accommodations on the basis of Section 504. If we look at other health impaired, and you look at the criteria that go into this, there are several questions that have to be answered in the affirmative before a kid can get special ed under OHI. One is, do they have a chronic or acute health problem that results in limited alertness? Chronic or acute health problem that results in limited alertness. By definition, ADHD is a chronic problem. Okay, you look at the criteria, you look at the outcomes for kids with ADHD, it is a chronic problem. Does it limit alertness? Well, heck, they do have attention problems, right? So, yeah, presumably there's demonstrable limited alertness that goes along with that particular chronic condition. So in most cases, this first prong for kids with ADHD is going to be answered with a yes. Secondly, does the health problem, in this case ADHD, adversely affect educational performance? Now, if you look at the DSM-4 TR criteria, those are the criteria that's set forth by the American Psychiatric Association for diagnosing kids with ADHD. One of those criteria is that the symptoms lead to impairment in either academic or social functioning or occupational functioning in the case of adults. So almost by definition, you have a good portion of kids with ADHD on the basis of that diagnosis that presumably are suffering from academic impairment. Now, what's left unsaid by these regulations is, what does adversely affect mean? What's the criteria for adverse effect? Does the kid have to be failing? Or are they a highly intelligent kid who's getting B's instead of A's? Where do we draw the line in terms of adverse effect? And how are we defining educational performance? I've seen some people make the argument that educational performance should be measured by academic achievement tests, norm-referenced, standardized achievement tests. Others, like myself, have made the argument that the true impairment educationally that these kids experience is not necessarily on an achievement test, but in their day-to-day educational functioning. Getting their work done, doing it accurately, getting their homework done, doing well on tests, all those kinds of things. But the law tells us nothing in terms of how that's defined. It's how you interpret it. That said, most kids with ADHD are going to meet this criterion by definition. And then the final one, and the kicker that's the most challenging, is, are special education and or related services necessary? And this is where our movement towards RTI, response to intervention, comes into place, which I'm presuming you guys are engaged in this school school system. And that is looking at to what degree are kids responding positively to evidence-based interventions that are applied in the general ed classroom. To the extent that they're not showing positive response to that, then they may need special education. To the extent that they are showing a positive response to that evidence-based intervention, they don't need special education. And I realize that there are challenges to the implementation of that, but that's kind of the prevailing view on how this is determined presently. So 3 things: chronic or acute health problem that results in limited alertness, adverse effect on educational performance, and are special ed services necessary? Those are the 3 things you have to answer in the affirmative for a kid with ADHD to get special education service access. Now, switching gears, out of special ed, looking at accommodations in the context of the Civil Rights Code, Section 504. What are the criteria that have to be met? They're looser, okay? They're looser. First, does the student have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? We're going to talk about the life activities here in a second, but by definition, ADHD is considered a mental impairment. Okay, it is a disorder of mental health. It's more specifically a disruptive behavior disorder. So it is, by definition, a mental impairment. Now, what are the life activities that it has to affect? At least one of these: learning, speaking, walking, seeing, hearing, or caring for oneself. Of course, the big one here is learning in an educational context. Now, of course, there's no definition given to us in terms of what that means or how much of what does substantially limit mean? You know, again, we go back to, does a kid have to be failing? Earning D's? Getting really low average achievement test scores? Where's that substantial limitation? How do we define it? And we don't really have any guidance from the law. In terms of that, it's how we interpret it at the local level. The last thing is, and again, it's a kicker, is the degree of impairment substantial? Again, I've already kind of alluded to it. You know, how badly is the kid impaired because of the ADHD? And, you know, the most common, not most common, but one of the conundrums in terms of this that we deal with is instances where kids who are pretty bright, who have ADHD, aren't getting A's. And so their parents are advocating for them to get services because they're only getting B's. Is that impairment? Is that substantial impairment? Getting a B instead of an A? Or let's take it to the adult ADHD level. We have adults with ADHD who request accommodations on the MCAT or the, what's the law? LSAT. So they did well in college, enough to the point where they're choosing to go on to law school or medical school, and they're looking for accommodations on those standardized measures because they're impaired by their ADHD symptoms. You know, and I don't pretend to have the answers to this. I'm just pointing out that there is a lot of, you know, interpretation here, subjectivity, and vagueness that surrounds this particular regulation. And some people exploit it and other people don't, and it gets interpreted differently at the local level. You all probably interpret it differently than we do in the school districts I work with up in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of individual differences in how this gets interpreted. The thing is, though, if you're found to violate it and a hearing officer substantiates the claim that you violated it, then you're liable for a penalty, a fine of some kind. And that has happened in the case of kids with ADHD to some districts. Now, the other thing that I will show you that I alluded to earlier is that IDEA is more restrictive than Section 504. So to qualify for special education is a more stringent process than 504. It's looser. And so you cannot make the same, you can't reach a simultaneous decision on IDEA qualification and 504. That's one place where schools have got dinged, is where their IDEA team got together and said, kid doesn't meet criteria for special education under OHI, and oh, by the way, doesn't qualify for accommodations either, on the basis of the same data. That's a no-no. Because 504 is broader. And so you need to be thinking, you have to interpret your data differently and more loosely, and you perhaps have to look at different data, maybe even with different individuals, to make that claim. So we've had some districts in my area that put their head in the sand about this, and 504, I don't want to hear about 504. We're stressed enough to meet IDEA, and we're not even going to worry about 504. Let the federal government come and find us. And then we have other districts that are overboard in the other direction. Every student with ADHD in that district has a 504 plan. Literally every one. Whether it's needed or not, because they're so afraid of the litigation. So the answer is somewhere in between those two extremes. And one of the things that I just want to caution you about is this last one, which is don't make IDEA and Section 504 decisions simultaneously using the same data and the same thresholds. You've got to broaden it for 504. Okay, so let's tie it up. Let's talk about, as a way to finish here, just some guiding principles, some things to kind of emphasize as we close out. Remember that we're thinking about school-based intervention in a broader context of multimodal intervention that includes home-based parent training, hopefully, along with potentially medication, at least in some cases for some kids. We know that stimulant medication is effective for reducing ADHD symptoms. However, psychosocial or behavioral treatments at home and school can not only address the symptoms, but also impact functioning. And hopefully I've sold you on the idea that we need to be thinking about functional impairments of these students beyond just their ADHD symptoms, that is a key area to focus our intervention on is actually their functional impairments rather than just their symptoms. Intervention design needs to be linked directly to assessment data. We've talked at length about functional assessment as one example. For academic interventions, curriculum-based assessment and other academic assessment data are going to be critical. A consultative problem-solving process is integral to intervention design. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow for those of you who are with me tomorrow. The idea here is that we're partnering with teachers, we're partnering also potentially with parents, and working collaboratively to design interventions. We're not just coming across as experts with the one idea that works. We want to intervene at the point of performance. So that is in the time and the setting where the behavior of interest is occurring. That's where the most effective interventions are going to be applied. The more removed we are from the point of performance, the more limited the effects of the intervention. We want to go beyond train and hope. We talked a little bit about this when we were discussing the intervention plans for our case examples for social skills, for example, where we talked about getting kids in a social skills training group where they're given some direct instruction in those skills. If we just train those and then hope that they will apply those skills out in the playground or the classroom or the neighborhood, we're really barking up the wrong tree. It's not going to work. We need to plan for generalization and plan for maintenance. Same thing with implementing an intervention plan in one grade level for a few months and assuming that somehow those gains are going to be transferred to the following grade level without us doing anything. We know that doesn't work. Okay, so we need to plan for generalization, plan for maintenance. Intervention needs to evolve based on ongoing assessment. We talked about database decision making as a key, using assessment data to make treatment decisions. All behavior serves a purpose. So we talked about functions of various challenging behaviors, and we need to think about interventions that build in a functional equivalent. So if we know that peer attention for inappropriate behavior is the function, then we want to build an intervention that allows for peer attention based on appropriate behavior. We're aiming for a balance in our intervention plans among proactive or preventive strategies, instructive strategies when those are necessary, when there's a skills deficit, and reactive or motivational strategies. We need a combination. We can't just rely on motivational strategies alone. We want to use multiple mediators, including teachers, to deliver intervention, but supplementing that with potentially parents, peers, computer technology, and the students themselves. And we need to remember, we need to give ourselves a break too, that the idea is that a multi-component, multi-setting intervention across time is what's going to be key. No single intervention is going to do the job, whether it be medication or any of the strategies we talked about today. They need to be implemented in a broader, multi-setting context over time to really be effective for this kind of chronic disorder. So at this point, again, I want to thank you for your attention throughout the day, your interest in this topic, your engagement with it. I've really enjoyed it. I'm certainly open to other questions at this point. But again, thank you for coming today.